you all for coming. If we can just start with a little demographic survey. How many of you remember this third wave, this most current wave of the civil rights movement? How many of you remember? Show of hands. Okay, so kind of, sort of. How many of you don't remember it? I mean, from the 1960s, the movement of the 1960s on. So you don't remember it, but you are aware of the history. Okay. And how many of you were there for at least some of it? Lived through it? Yeah, okay, aging ourselves, but it's all good stuff. So there are many of us remember it. Many of us lived through it, but all of us have some connection to it, either because we lived through it or because we heard about it. But during that time, I think the one thing that we can agree on is that we all knew what we were fighting for. We all knew what we were fighting against. And we all knew who stood on what side. You all agree? Disagree? Agree. So I hope that we can also agree that we have made progress, that there is still a long way to go. And what we understand is that racism is still embedded in many of our institutions. It is embedded in our structures. So it is perpetrated by people who aren't even aware that that is what it is happening. Because for us, a lot of this is like breathing. We are so much in the water that we don't even know that we are in it. So I'd like to start just by, if we can all agree on that, which I think we do. Anybody who disagrees? No? Okay. Then let's start with our panelists. And first question, and we will start with you, Dottie, who was too young to live through it, but let's start with you. And one question is, do you think that there is still need for a movement?
No, most definitely. I think we'll get into a lot of areas in the course of the evening that demonstrate just how important it is for there to be a movement today that continues to work for racial justice in many, many different realms. So I think there are ways in which a movement today is even more critical because the sides are not so clear as they were back in the 60s and early 70s. So it's a lot more complex and layered in today's world than I think it was then. And it probably was then, but we just weren't quite aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone on the panel disagree with that? So everybody agrees that we do need a movement. Okay, then let's talk about how that movement needs to change. Because in the 60s, we were marching, we were also in the courts. There were very specific strategies used by progressives and by advocates. Christina, are those strategies, particularly the legal ones, as clear-cut today? What has changed about trying to use policy to move our progress forward?
Well, I think the unfortunate part is that law and policy usually takes decades to catch up with what's actually happening in communities, be it through the legislator or court cases. And litigation is something that takes decades to sometimes accomplish what needs to be accomplished. Mm-hmm. So the need for kind of like a multi-pronged approach to dealing with racial disparity is one where we should be marching, we should be having court cases, we should be out there talking to our legislators, we should be educating people. There should be a a multi-pronged approach, because the law, unfortunately, is not one that works quickly. And also, it's in its creation, the law is based on white supremacy. And there's no way of getting around that. As an attorney, you are working with the law that's on the books and hope to change the law little bit by little bit, but you have to understand that whether it be a jury or whether it be a judge, you have to present your case understanding that there's going to be some bias in that, and trying to navigate that is the challenging part of it all. So there needs to be more out there from not just the bar, as we call attorneys, but more from the communities and pushing us to be more active.
Thank you. Davon, here you are, and you ran actually for a seat, right? And can you talk about that and why you, as an emerging leader, decided to go the way of policy instead of marching in the streets or doing some other form of activism?
Well, for myself and for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, it's certainly a multi-pronged approach in terms of what we feel is necessary to address some of the racial inequalities. In terms of one of the things that inspired me to get involved, one of the biggest problems that I think we see today is with the advent of mass media, there's a whole lot more of what some folks refer to as like the weapons of mass distraction. So there's so many things that distract us from seeing the massive inequities that exist in our society, so much so that even the folks that are most directly affected by it are unaware to the extent that those inequities affect their own lives and their access to opportunity and wealth and so forth. So a big part of my work involves educating folks to understand and interpret the world in such a way that is in their own interest. Because what we find is that mainstream discourses about politics is such that it imposes a lens of analysis that is alien to those who are most afflicted. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people distrust their own intuition about the extent of the inequities that exist. And this to the benefit of those who are benefiting from the structural racism that we see in our society. So that's a big part of my personal motivation to get involved, is to show people that I come in contact with every day as a teacher, to see the world in a way that will help them understand the things they need to do in their own lives to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little about the inequities, and I just want to read a little bit of statistics here. Whites are more likely than members of racial ethnic minority groups to attend primary and secondary school with smaller class sizes, to have access to computer technology in public schools and at home during primary and secondary schooling, to attend and graduate from a four-year college or university, to earn higher salaries, to retain employment during a downturn in an economy, to be covered by health insurance, to gain access to health insurance, to survive life-threatening illnesses. And what we also know is that the wealth disparity, along with the health disparity, is frightening. And particularly since the 2008 recession, there has been a massive loss in households of color, particularly African American and Latino. We know that Black infants are almost 2.5 times as likely to die as white infants before the age of 1. The gap, even with all of this progress, is growing wider and wider. I read an article this morning, a noted economist, an African American economist, who basically said, well, wait a minute, with so much progress, you just can't point to racism anymore. And all of these programs that we have really create and promote a system of entitlement. Why can't, as other groups do, African Americans and Latinos succeed? How would you answer that? Davon, you're shaking your head, so let me start with you.
So one of the things that I think has happened is that, the terrain, the political terrain of the language that people use and the perspectives that are used to talk about politics is such that it frames out certain elements of not just the inequities, but just the elements of the life of Black people in this country that make it hard to really understand why that question is really a nonsensical, or that statement by that economist is a nonsensical statement. And what I mean is this, is that on one hand, we live in a society that folks want Black people to not depend on the government. There's always this, the welfare baby, or the welfare mother and the crack baby, all these images that were produced as a way to frighten whites and to enrage whites to feel like, their money's being spent on, But on the other hand, when Black folks decide, okay, well, let's build our own institutions, let's have, the stuff that primarily affects our lives should be controlled by us, that there's fear of that. So I think what's problematic about even that statement is that if you want black folks to do for ourselves, then let us actually do for ourselves, right? And so that's one element of it. The other element is that in order for America to have garnered the kind of wealth that would make it a world superpower was the economic engine of slavery. The 246 years of slavery, of free labor, made it possible, the wealth accumulation made it possible for America to rise as a global superpower. So when we talk about entitlements, we're not talking about black folks asking for white people's stuff. We're talking about black folks asking for their stuff back, stuff that was taken from us because of the free labor, and give us the investment that we made to even make it possible for whites to have the kind of wealth that they have in the first place. And I think until that then is put in the discourse to reframe the conversation, then economists will always be able to frame the conversation as, they're asking for handouts instead of, really talking about the fact that the wealth is based on other people's, our folks, black people, and the work that we put in to make white America as wealthy as it is.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that point a little later. But before we do, Anthony McCarthy, Reverend McCarthy, there has always been some involvement in any civil rights movement of faith-based institutions. Where is that involvement now?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me. What a joy to be part of these ongoing conversations. The young lady who introduced us earlier said my show is on Fridays, and that was in fact true up until today. My show is now 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 5 to 7 on WEAA. So right now, if you were in your car or in your house, you would be listening to me talking about my new show. But Adar asked me to participate in this, and so for the kickoff of my show, I asked the station if we could record the show early. So we recorded it this morning, and it's airing right now.
Thank you, Anthony.
My pleasure. Anytime that I can be a part of a conversation of moving my people forward, but ultimately moving our society forward, is very important to me. I agree with everything that everyone said. The caveat to what I would add before I answer your question is that we do have people in our society who do believe that they are entitled. There are people in society, regardless of color, white, red, green, who believe that we really should be providing a certain level of quality of life. Now, that varies from person to person. I believe that we should be providing all citizens with a certain level of quality of life. There are too many people in our society that are hungry. There are too many people in our society that are homeless. Where I think we merge, all of us merge, is that there are historic, chronicled institutions in our society that have created these situations. And if we continue to bury our head in the sand and be distracted by the successes, because we have had success, we have come a long way in a society. I mean, if you just use the measure that we are no more, African Americans are no longer used as human chattel in this country, we've come far. But we have not come so far that we don't have enormous work to do. And that's why I do what I do. I know that's why these folks do what they do. The church as an institution has been both a blessing and a curse to the struggle for civil rights, for racial equality in this country. I remember growing up in the South. I'm in my very early 40s. And I remember that we were taught that everything was going to be okay. If we could just but believe in a paternal God that was going to make everything all right for us. That it would wipe away the racial injustice, it would wipe away the lynchings, it would wipe away the rapes, it would wipe away the stain of slavery in this country. And we know that that's not true. As a man of faith, I do believe that there is enormous power in this universe that when harnessed for good, can do great things. But I also believe that we have a system in this country, as my sister said, that the very laws of our country are racist. And that exists today. That's not a symptom of the 60s or the 50s. That exists today in this city. We know that our educational institutions are racist and that children of color by public policy, by decisions made many times by black politicians, are treated unequal in this society. From the resources that they get to educate our children to the very education that we're giving our children to prepare them to operate in a very increasing technical world. Our children in the city are being held back, and it's racism that holds them back. Now, people say, well, no, it's this and it's that, but at every level of institution in our society, we can trace it back to racism. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes people say, oh, you're not acknowledging. Well, I acknowledge that we've come far. But when it comes to faith, I think that the church has lost its way. We still are a very segregated society. And I will tell you, the fact that people enjoy being in the company of people of the same race, or that bothers me less than the mentality that I enjoy being in the company of people of my race because we are better than. That bothers me. I worship with people of all faiths. I worship with people of all color. And we in the church have become just as racist as an institution. Oftentimes, the black church, instead of teaching liberation and power, teaches racism and hatred. We'd like to point the finger and say, this is because of whites, and if you stay here in the confines of this black church, you'll be saved, you're going to be empowered, you're going to be uplifted. Well, unfortunately, in the real world, we must push ourselves into society. And until the church addresses the inequity of wealth in this country, poverty, education, and the miseducation, gender gaps in my church. I'm part of an incredible church family. But I've only been in this church for about a year and a half, but I found a home. But you know, the problem with home is you get comfortable. And when you're comfortable, you start looking around. And I recognize that this beautiful church where I learn and I worship and I hug and kiss and love these people every day, we have events at our church, is a horrible misogynist institution where it's run by men. Women are celebrated, but women are not put in charge. Almost women are marginalized in my church. So I had a conversation with my pastor, and he gave me these funny looks. But I said to him, I said, you know what? I think I was sent here for a reason. And I think that if we're going to be a faith institution, that we have to find a way to break the chains that we, black people, put on women every single day. We learn well from our oppressors. That to learn to hate and misogyny became our weapon against women. And to my surprise, he agreed. And he said, Anthony, we must begin to turn this wheel. And I've been trying for years to turn this wheel. I said, well, you now have another shoulder to put towards the wheel. Because I can't be part of an institution that treats women as second-class citizens, no more than I could be part of an institution that treats African Americans, gay and lesbians, or any other part of our family as second-class citizens. The church has failed miserably in its role at being an institution that could, in fact, be a healer in this society. So I hope that answered your question.
No, it's really good, and actually you brought up for me about 5 more questions. So let me just turn to Dottie, and this helps us circle back to some of what Davon said too, to really talk about terms. Because a lot of times when we talk about racism, where the national narrative goes, is to a conversation about interpersonal racism. You don't like me, I don't like you, it's all interpersonal. And what I hear so many of you on a panel talking about is the structural, where, like you said, Anthony, you know, that African Americans can be perpetrators, right? That men can be perpetrators. So if we can kind of get clearer so that we're all on the same page in this discussion. And if you can also talk about kind of the matrix of oppression, which you brought up, it's a big term just to talk about how this is all interconnected. We can be talking about racial oppression, gender oppression, any type of oppression. Can you just clear these terms up for us, give us more clarity?
One of the things we focus on a lot in our training that Baltimore Racial Justice Action does is definitions of terms. And when we do that, we are very clear that the definitions we're putting out there are our redefinitions. And the reason we redefine terms is that a racist structure uses its own definitions to muddy the waters. And we want clarity. We want to be very, very clear that when we're talking about racism, we're talking about that structural system that advantages white people and disadvantages people of color. So we're very specific about using racism within that context. Anyone can have racial prejudice. Any group can exercise racial prejudice like the church does if they're talking about all white people are evil. That's racial prejudice. But we would not call that racism because that church does not have the power within the larger society to actually exercise power over white people in the way that the term racism implies power over people of color by white institutions and structures. So that's a very specific difference between how you would see racism defined in the dictionary or how it's used in the media particularly. It's used in the media to very much make things very blurry. And one of the moments that sticks in my memory all the time around that particular term of racism is that I was once talking to a colleague who had asked me to come to talk to some people who were designing a course. It had to do with health, but they wanted to bring in issues of race into how racism is embedded in health practices and policies. And we got on that topic of defining racism as a one-way street, as it's a system used by white people to disadvantage people of color and advantage white people. And there were two professors, both African American, who were really arguing with me about that. And they kind of were basically saying, hey, we should have an equal right to be racist. That's kind of what it boiled down to. And I was having a really hard time convincing them that this redefinition, was really important to the clarity of talking about how racism operates. And I finally said, I'm a white person, I've been white all my life, and I can promise you that if you equate racial prejudice by people of color against white people with racism, white people will use it in order to absolve themselves of responsibility for a racist system that they created and are really responsible for. And they went, oh, yeah, that got it. The matrix of oppression is extremely important because race is one dimension of all of our identities, and we have many other dimensions: gender, sexual orientation, economic class, ability and disability, all of those categories in which some people have been advantaged and given privilege, and other groups of people don't have that same level of privilege and advantage. And in our model of working against racism, we always acknowledge that these other categories must be taken into account in any effort toward justice. If we're to have racial justice, people of color have different identities along all those other dimensions. So we're leaving out the very group we're seeking justice for if we don't at the same time consider all other forms of oppression. So it's extremely important to us to acknowledge and be vigilant about where we might be oppressing people under other categories as we're talking about and working toward racial justice, and holding ourselves accountable to not do that, to remember that justice is for everyone.
Thank you. The economist that I mentioned, in his article, one of the things that he said was that he has a website, and his website gives certificates to white people absolving them of any responsibility of structural racism.
Oh, God.
He passes out certificates. Yes, he does. And I'm sure it will not surprise you if I tell you that one of his best friends is Thomas Sowell, yes, who is an African-American conservative, very conservative economist. So if we agree that this movement is still continuing, as underground or surfaced as it may be, and that it is needed. We know that when we talk about racism, we really are talking about structures and institutions. So can white people be Harriet Tubmans in the 21st century? This woman from Dorchester County, Maryland, who made more than 19 trips there to free Africans and African Americans who were enslaved, brought over 300 of them to safety, who made two quotes, inspirational quotes. She said, "You go on or you die." And she also said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew that they were enslaved." So here we are, and we bear that legacy. And every time when we have discussions about, interpersonal racism, there's a way that we're saying you are over there, or as you would say, Anthony, white people is evil. So where are the Harriet Tubmans? Who are the Harriet Tubmans? And what characteristics would those Harriet Tubmans have today? Christina?
Well, I think it's probably one of the most interesting questions that we could play around with here, just because an advocate comes in many different shapes and comes on a very large spectrum. And one of my mentors in law school, Tom Perez, who's been appointed or was nominated for an appointment with the Department of Labor, and I had him for 2 clinics. And he and I would often clash on different topics, and one of them was basically, how do you deliver a message? How do you get a law passed? How do you litigate your cases? And one of the things he says, when you are, we were talking about transgender justice, and he says, when you're thinking about passing a bill for transgender justice, and remember, this is probably about 8-9 years ago when we had this conversation, when marriage equality and all other LGBT issues hadn't really come to the forefront yet. And he said to me, well, if you're trying to pass an equity bill, you should think about who you're going to have bring your testimony. Is it someone who's transgendered, or is it someone who has a family member who's transgendered, or who understands the issues that need to be dealt with? And he was basically saying you put the person with the best face to make the best argument. And recognizing that the system, in fact, is broken and is set up to marginalize people. And that's how our system keeps turning. And I remember being very angry with him. And I said to him, basically what you're saying is the system is broken, but we'll still keep playing with it, and we will still abide by their rules. And that was a hard thing as a first-year law student to hear something like that, someone who came with like this excitement about changing the world. But what I've come now 9 years later to come to understand is that the spectrum is so wide. Someone could be a hardcore advocate who says, I will not take any injustice at all or whatsoever. And then you'll have someone who's willing to bend at every moment at the opposite sides. And then you'll have the people in the middle who are able to deliver a message, and a message that may not be as strong as either of those sides. Mm-hmm. And you have to come to this compromise and understand where you fall within that spectrum, because both of the ends really influence the people in the middle who are trying to get things done. So I think it's one of the hard things to figure out where you are. And I think in life, sometimes I'm someone who's gung-ho and willing to take everybody on and willing to take people and challenge them on every single word that they say. And sometimes I'm someone who has to either sit back and listen and hear things that are ugly. Mm-hmm. But understanding where you are in life, whether you need to protect yourself from ugliness or if you're willing to take on that ugliness. So, and I think we're to come back to answering your question, which was a very circuitous way to get there, is by saying that you have to keep looking for people who are your allies. They may not be your allies today, but they may be tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And kind of explore those different topics, and through education and through conversations to see whether or not they're actually going to be helpful in the struggle. Mm-hmm. And to understand that sometimes you will walk into people who are saying ugly things and who are actually perpetuating the oppression and you have to figure out how to engage with them. Because there may be other issues, especially when we're talking about the matrix of domination, of the matrix of oppression, that they're going to be on your side on some issues. But teasing that out is going to be a lot harder. So identification, I think in this particular period is it's very difficult at some points because we don't have one stream, one message that's being delivered all the time.
Thank you. And Davon?
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. I guess that to me there are two layers of it. The first is that, and when when I talk about racism and white supremacy, using Neely Fuller and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's term racism and white supremacy, it is paradigmatic of how society operates. So when you talk about the last 500 years, we're talking about a history of European colonialism and domination throughout the entire world. So everything that people have come to know to be true is filtered through the lens of European culture and history. And so with that being said, then culture then as kind of a lens or kind of an epistemological framework, it prefigures all the other elements that we're talking about when we talk about other issues of justice. So we're talking about gender, right? Notions of gender are prefigured by culture, right? And one of the things that, the question, where are the current day Harriet Tubmans, to me evokes kind of a notion of, in terms of the way that gender interrelates with issues of racism and white supremacy. And I think it intersects in this way. I think one of the problems that we have, particularly in the Black community, in terms of leadership, is that there's certain gender dynamics that have defined the contours of Black leadership, I think, to the disadvantage of Black folks. And that, you can describe it based on what some folks have characterized as the charismatic Black leader syndrome, right? Which is kind of the straight, attractive, very, verbose Black male leader that oftentimes is selected by the media and given to Black folks, and then we accept them. And what has happened is that then it undermines it undermines the ability of those, particularly Black women, from being able to garner the same level of respect in terms of being considered a leader by mainstream society, right? But it has also confined the types of Black masculinity that is acceptable to be a leader in those different positions. So I think when we talk about where the current day Harriet Tubmans, because of the advent of mass media and the way that then gender in the context of white supremacy has constituted what's acceptable leadership, there are many leaders then that are silenced or suppressed because it doesn't match well the map that has been prefigured for folks to be accepted as leaders. So that's one of the second thing really quickly is that, this is something that, going back to the campaign, when I ran for city council back in 2011, and I didn't explain it this way then, but I think one of the biggest problems we have today in terms of Black leadership, and I'm still trying to decide whether I think this applies more to, I think, younger leaders than maybe some of our elders, but there is an internalization of all of us that that Black people, in terms of what our abilities are, there's this internalization of what the word nigger represents, right? And what I mean is that, one of the things that happens to me a lot is that, especially like when I do panels or do events, one of the things that happens to me a lot is it's like, wow, you're so intelligent, you're so smart, that's so great. And, they're compliments, right? But what it demonstrates is that for them, the capacity for a young Black boy from West Baltimore to be so articulate and so, whatever, to them, it's beyond what they have reserved in their mind is an appropriate place for a Black person to be. And I think this is true on many levels. And this isn't just white folks that do this. It's something that we've internalized as well. And I remember, one of the things I had to do during the campaign was, in order to even be taken seriously, I had to, flex intellectually, for lack of a better term, to even get taken seriously. And even to the point where, there are folks who are in very powerful, who are in positions of power who it is beyond them conceptually to see a black person or black people being able to do for ourselves. Like it's beyond their realm of imagination. And they wouldn't articulate it that way, but it's beyond their realm of imagination. And they need a certain amount of Europeanness in them in order for them to see us as being able to do for ourselves. And I think that is something that I know that I've experienced. And I think has a lot to do with why certain leaders then aren't lifted up, because it just doesn't fit, with the internalization of the fact that some people look at me and all they can see is a nigger. That's all they can imagine. And I think that's really important.
Anthony?
I want to be very careful not to just agree and repeat what was said by these panelists, because I find myself just agreeing so much with what they're saying. The amazing thing about where we find ourselves, well, especially with this question, is I read the question, but now it strikes me as I listen, who are the Harriet Tubmans, and who is doing this work, and who do we define as leaders? And as Davon said, oftentimes I have found in my life that we are not selecting leaders. Leaders are chosen, and then they become the spokesperson. They fall into this default position. And I'm talking about white community and black community. I can speak from my perspective as an African-American male who's worked in the media and have worked in government and have worked in the church, that we have learned so well this idea of, if we want progress to be made, we have to be very careful about the words we choose. We have to be very careful about the way we dress. We have to be very careful with how we style our hair. We have to be very, and I know that sounds shallow, but it is true. As someone who participated in campaigns and public policy strategies, we knew when we were fighting for LGBT rights or African American rights, it was very important who sat at that table to testify before these decision makers. It was almost as if we had abdicated. No, we had come to accept that these people hold our fate in their hand, and we have to learn to play their game in order to be successful. And I have to tell you, I played the game well. All the things that Davon said about being articulate, flexing intellectually, I did and do. Without any hint of, I need to be any differently. I can't be street. I don't use slang very well. When I do, people pick up that I am
A novice.
a novice at it. I even curse. And people say, don't do that. You just don't curse very well. But I've learned through those life experiences about how absolutely infiltrated, I don't even know if that's the word, we are with this racist structure. In everything, and it's taken me a while to be able to admit this, but it is so true. People think that leaders are just organically grown and they come out of a movement and they become part of the larger conversation. No, they don't. Jane Miller chooses who the spokesperson is for a certain neighborhood or a certain incident. Channel 2 chooses, and that's how it works. That really is sadly how it works. Now, I was on a panel in New York a couple of months ago, and this beautiful white woman said, it was an LGBT panel. She said, well, who is the Martin Luther King of the LGBT movement? And I listened to all these people come up with these great names of people, and that's who the new Martin Luther King. And when she got to me, I said, well, Martin Luther King Jr. is the Martin Luther King Jr. of the LGBT movement. And she said, well, that's impossible. I said, well, when you look at his life and you look at the struggle and you look at his contributions, those lessons are lessons that we can, in fact, co-opt and use. Those are lessons that we should use. Harriet Tubman is the Harriet Tubman of the modern civil rights movement. Because when she led those slaves to freedom and when she held them and said, I will not let you go back. I would rather, and she was in control, I would rather shoot you dead than let you continue to live under a structure that treats you less than human, that doesn't even recognize a scintilla of humanity in you. Harriet Tubman is the example. And not all of us can do that. Not all of us have the stomach for it. But I have Davon and Adam and the folks from the leaders of a Beautiful Struggle on my show, because there are times when we disagree. But I find it so necessary to have people on my show who will say things that I can't always say, because I speak to a huge, broad audience, and I need them to continue to tune in so that we can continue to change and click those gears. So sometimes, I don't know if they will admit it to you, I will say to Davon and other people before we go on the air, I need you to be you. I don't want you to hold back. And if I push back on you, you push me right back. Because I think it's so important that we speak truth to power, even when it makes us uncomfortable. But I also think that in the structures of, even when we were fighting for trans rights, and there were people who were fighting for the liberation of the transgender community who did not want transgender people to speak for themselves. Well, we can't, because people won't feel comfortable if we put them in front of the panel and they talk about their lives. So let's get their mother to talk about how her daughter was treated, or let's get the uncle or the friend to talk about what happened. There are times when I feel really bad at the end of the day, Professor Colbert, I feel horrible sometimes at the end of the day, because I've had to trick racists. I've had to use trickery to be able to put the hard, ugly truth on the table sometime. Because there are people, and I'm going to stop, but there are people who have the power in these institutions who need to feel like, well, at least Anthony understands what we're going through. But they don't understand that I put Davon there so he could just put it right in their face. And then they look at me as this moderating force. But I keep them at the table. And I am all for changing the law. We have to change the law. I'm all for marching. We have to march. But at the end of the day, as a man of faith, my goal is to open someone's heart, to break down all that mess that we have been taught and that we have been told is the truth. Break that down and let someone open their heart to say, oh my God, you know, I've been wrong about this all my life. And I didn't even know I was wrong.
All right, before we open it up, I just have two more questions that I hope you all can answer quickly. But I'm going to start by saying I so disagree with you, which I very rarely do. But the open hearts, it's not that I disagree.
Oh, I understand.
But you know, there's always been this debate about opening hearts and minds or policy. And at the end of the day, if somebody's, whether their heart and mind is open or closed, what I really want is for wherever they are, that they not have the power to impact my life and the lives of my children. Whether their heart's open or closed, that's up to them, free will, do whatever you need to do. But at the end of the day, whether your heart is open or closed, it should not have the power to impact my life. Would you agree with me there?
No, I do. I agree with you
Okay.
100%.
So let me ask this whole concept of diversity and multiculturalism. That seemed to spring up when the conversation started to turn toward the ways in which the historical structure of this country really deliberately kept African Americans and other people of color down. It seemed as if all those years ago, when we really started having those conversations on the cusp of them, all of a sudden we had the diversity and the multicultural movement, which, we do not have people who wear eyeglasses in our organization, let's go get them. We have people from the North and not from the South in our organization, let's go get them. And it seemed as if the concept of diversity was defined in as many different ways as is diversity. And it took the focus from those historic, systemic, race-based, gender-based, other-based issues which impact our lives. Is that a fair statement or is that not? Your thoughts? Dottie?
I think it's a very fair statement. I think it was a very strategic move to begin to use that kind of terminology and way of thinking that, oh, we have all these differences and let's just appreciate the differences and get together and enjoy each other's food and things like that. Excuse me. I think there has been some positive things about it, though. In my experience over the last 20 or so years, it has, that term diversity being adopted and taken up as a goal for different organizations and businesses has at least created an opening where, again, some of us who get into that opening redefine that term. And we say, this is what diversity means to us. And we explain that we deal with diversity in terms of historical patterns of oppression. And so I think there are many organizations and institutions that never would have even welcomed anyone into the conversation who have gotten into that conversation and even gotten a little bit and done some work around it.
I think that we have become so caught up in the look and what things look like that we have forgotten what things should be. When Thurgood Marshall died and people said we need an African American on the Supreme Court, I'm not sure if we needed Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court for the sake of diversity. I'm not sure, well, I could give you many examples of that, but what I do know is, as Dottie said, that the conversation and the movement in this country, remember there was a time in this country where everything was about diversity. The posters were about diversity and these organizations were out looking for black members and male members and, it was just this fascinating time in America. And just like so many other things, we so easily can go overboard. But without that movement, the cracks that were made in this structural racism, that great people were able to slip through those cracks and begin to push the language and the movement and their actions, that siver, they would be able to push that crack open further and further and further. So the blessing in diversity, which I will tell you, I've grown to despise the word.
I do too.
But the blessing in that movement, in that moment, in that period in American history, world history, was that we did move that very, very heavy weight of oppression. We moved it further up the mountain.
And let me stop you there and ask Christine or Devon anything to contribute to this, or should we move on?
Well, the one thing I would say about diversity is it's a much more palatable word than saying racism, especially
What, palatable to whom?
to the people in charge who are white people. And so it's a word that's used to make things so we could just sing Kumbaya together. I think that's where we're heading. That's what we want as a society.
That's right.
But unfortunately, when you're looking at diversity, it sweeps everything else under the table. And that conversation it's a non-starter. Because if you have tortillas with some salsa, then all of a sudden we love our Mexican brothers or sisters and we're celebrating Cinco de Mayo, and all of a sudden immigration is no longer that important because we're celebrating with them.
Right.
So I think that's the one thing that we have to be careful of, is that easy words and words that are palatable to the structure, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, we should just be skeptical. We should just be skeptical and try to figure out a way to redefine the words. And as Dottie redefined racism and earlier, when she says all white people are racist, that's not going to go well. That's kind of like people
People don't want to hear that.
People don't want to hear that. Where if you say diversity, we would like to have white people and we would like to have people of color and et cetera. People are able to get along a little bit better with that. So it's messaging that can open doors, but it's a non-starter at the end of the day, if that's where you begin.
That's where you stay.
Yeah.
Or begin. Devon.
Just real quick, I feel like when people use the term diversity as a strategy to deal with racism, it's one of those things. It lets me further know that you don't really understand what the issues are at hand, and so I think it's a good term when people confidently talk about we need diversity. it's, to me, it's a signal that you don't understand the issues of racism.
Thank you. Well, with that, I really want to open for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much.
And you are?
My name is Mark.
Mark, take a seat, ask your question.
Thank you very much. It's a very good presentation to the panelists. Many of my forebears in the Jewish community have participated in the struggle to help everybody in a diverse community, achieve equal rights and so forth. Many of our forebears are rabbis that marched with Dr. King in the civil rights era and have been very much a part of helping bring communities together. We, just about every public building has the Weinberg name throughout Baltimore. But I also have noticed that there's been some sort of concern that some people think that some of us, and it happens in all communities, that we have some people who are up to date or some people who are not so careful or whatever. And I just want to know whether it's Jewish or Hispanic, African American, what can we do, or Korean for that matter, what can we do to bridge ourselves together? We have so many differences, but particularly in the Jewish and African American communities, we have a common background. We have been experiencing some slavery of different kinds. So what can we do to bring ourselves together and achieve more together?
Thank you, Mark. Panelists, can I ask a question first? Because that's one thing that I hear a lot, is that we have a common background, that we're all in this together. But my question is, are we in America? Have we had that common background and common experiences in America? Because particularly when you read the different histories of both groups in the country, they're just things that continue to stand out, particularly as our those two peoples have diverged, as one has become white in America, viewed as white in America, and the other has not. And then when you look at foundational organizations, one collaboration like the NAACP, part of the people who were founders of the NAACP were Jewish, but then when you read the minutes of the documents as to how African Americans in that organization were perceived, you see a very different message. So is the narrative that Mark has expressed, and that I think we have all heard and on some level buy into, is that an accurate narrative historically in this country? Christina?
One of the things that I find striking from this conversation is that, yes, I would love for everyone to get along and play well together. But unfortunately, we live in a society that has oppression as its main flagship, essentially. So I think the better question is not to say we've all been oppressed and we should all be getting along, but rather switch the focus to talk about it from a different perspective of saying, how am I enjoying my privilege to oppress others? So where is it that I'm a light-skinned Latina, for example, I know that I am not as persecuted or will not get as stopped as much as my African-American brothers and sisters, or my dark-skinned Latino, they're not calling for my papers every second of the day. So what am I doing to enjoy that privilege of having lighter skin? Or what privilege am I enjoying for being a Christian here in the United States? What does that look like? What am I being someone who is now upwardly mobile? What is the economic success offering me? And to be very honest, I have moments where I enjoy my privilege and I know I'm enjoying it and I do nothing about it. So my challenge to myself and hopefully to others is to say, have a bell go off and say, here it is, I'm enjoying something that I didn't earn. I'm enjoying it because I'm part of a privileged group. So I think if we start the conversation from there, it would be a lot easier to discuss how we could band together, understanding that when you're engaging with someone who is white, and they may have good intentions, but what they're saying is rubbing you the wrong way, because in fact it is a racist statement, to say, how am I going to talk about this in a way where you could recognize that you're oppressing me at this very moment, and the institution is oppressing me. But we need to get past it. So changing that focus from all being oppressed to one of, I need to change my privilege, and I need to struggle for myself and for others to help other people lift up.
And that's a very different focus. And I'll tell you, as a straight woman in America, that focus off oppression onto privilege helped me a lot, even in my own understanding of the privilege that I hold. So thank you, because that is a very helpful focus to have. And I think Davon wanted to say.
Yeah, I just want to say that coalitions, I think, are more complex than people deciding they want to work together. And I think that's really important for people to understand. I'll give kind of an anecdote to kind of put this in context. So for a year, so after I was done with my debate career, I did another year of school. I coached a debate team. One of the arguments we ran, it was on an argument, it was a topic about nuclear weapons. We were making an argument about the importance of black nationalism. So we're talking about black nationalism. And a part of the top of the clip that they played was a clip of Minister Louis Farrakhan talking about the importance of burning down America. And the judge just happened to be, a Jewish judge who, I think he's probably judged me a few times, but had judged this team and voted for this team before. And so I was sitting in the back of the room, and he was giving his decision. And what he said was he voted for the team that I coached, but he had given them 0 speaker points, which is unspeakable. The lowest you're supposed to give is 25. The range is 25 to 30. And he said, I gave them 0s because they played that evil man, Louis Farrakhan. He said, my parents, they marched with Dr. King, and when I was a child, I was there, and so it's really upsetting, because a part of their argument also was they played the Black National Anthem. He said, that's not the Black National Anthem, because my people were there, and they were in the struggle as well. And one of the things, we had kind of an intense back and forth, but one of the things that, I made it a point to say to him, and the reason why I think that anecdote is important, is because sometimes coalitions can act as ways to co-opt things that are authentically black culture and allow other people to be then the cultural engines of another people's movement. And so one of the things that I explained to him is that, it's our responsibility to decide who our leaders are, who the scholars that we want to revere, that's our responsibility. And as an ally, it is important for you in a coalition to respect the fact that there are certain folks that we're going to lift up as leaders or lift up as people that we think have something to say, and that, you have to respect that. A lot of times what ends up happening is that because people see coalitions as just people deciding to work together, right? And it's interesting, if you look at the history, particularly the history of black people and Jewish people in the United States, that there's a very common history of that, right? Where for instance, the foundational text on black people during Reconstruction, right? That was a text that initially was written, I forget the name, but by a Jewish scholar, that the governmental agency that helped to fund that research, picked a Jewish scholar instead of W.E.B. Du Bois. He ended up writing his own text on that anyway, right? And so there are all these examples of where, the condition of black folks is used as a way to support the movement of others. So it's important that in coalition that we make sure that it's an authentic coalition where everyone's interests are equally represented, and not that one interest is used as a way to articulate everybody's interest as the same. Because then what will end up happening is that our particular struggle will be reduced to something that is more in the interest of someone else than our own.
Can I say something real fast? I promise. I think that we have to be very careful not to become lazy in this struggle to make a better society. We have to be willing to do that heavy, uncomfortable work. And I think that we've become a society where I just don't want a daughter to feel bad. So I'm not going to talk about this, or I'm not going to debunk that theory. African American people have taught the world what it means to survive. And I'm not saying the Jewish people didn't do it. I'm not saying that whites who did, but I am saying that African American people endured something so horrific. Now, other things around the world are going on right now that are so brutal, so bloody, so violent. But I am struck by those movements who look to what black people did in this country to become free. That when those Chinese students were in Tiananmen Square and tanks were coming, they locked arms and they sang, "We shall overcome," in perfect English. Because they had seen what black people had done. When I was on the phone with, during the Arab Spring, and there was what was happening all over the Middle East, and we were talking to Egyptian students, and we're like, so now, how did you develop this strategy? And they told us, well, we had a great debate within our organizations about nonviolence, or that we would take up armed resistance. And I listened to them, and they spoke the language of the African American civil rights movement in America. And so what we have done, I've done, is become so comfortable in my privilege. I'm a African American male with a certain amount of notoriety, far from straight, but I recognize that I can, in fact, be absorbed in and camouflage myself in straight society when I want to. And I enjoy those privileges at moments which I am so wrought with guilt, because I know we're supposed to be doing the work, the heavy lifting, the rubbing, that when I take a moment to sit back and go, okay, well, I'm going to sit on this pulpit at my church and be everything that they think I am, or at least not debunk what they think I am. I can't do that. Can't do that. Too many people have really died. And I'm not talking about just here in this country, I mean around the world.
And what I
For me
hear
to
you
be
talking
silent.
about is accountability too, which we will come back to later.
Understand.
But other audience
Sorry.
questions? Anyone want to step up to the mic? What? Come on, please.
So my question actually responds to what you just said, and I was struck by the fact that the Egyptian students had the vocabulary of the American civil rights movement, because the students I teach don't have that vocabulary, and they are in the United States. They
Where do you teach, or is that getting too much in you, all up in the
In the
Kool-Aid?
business.
I teach at Towson University.
Okay. Thank you.
And what I guess what fascinates me is that there are people throughout the world who are able to conjure up images of the civil rights movement and the sounds of the civil rights movement, but 7 miles up the road, maybe closer to 10 miles up the road, there's an entire demographic that doesn't know who Emmett Till is, and can maybe quote the lyrics out of Future and Lil Wayne's song, but have no idea who he is. So I don't necessarily know that there's a question built into there, but more an observation, and an observation that is part of the reason that I came to this event, because I think about something like We Shall Overcome, and if we had a movement right now, what would the songs be? You know, is Lil Wayne gonna be the go-to? Like, is that who we're gonna sing in the streets? And yeah, so
Thank you so much.
all I
Thank
had to
you.
say.
And Davon, this is a question made for you. Davon, you can tell your own story. Go ahead.
Well, so it's interesting, actually, with the Towson. It was on their debate team. Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I first got to campus, when I was at Towson, I remember feeling like the Black Student Union, I go to their meetings, and people are dressed really nice, and people are, more engaged with, popular culture than, our struggle. And so I spent a lot of time trying to fight against that. And I think me and a couple other folks successfully created a culture where at least it was cool to some extent to, push the envelope in terms of racial justice. One thing I will say is that the passage, and I don't want to place blame, the passage of information from our elders to us, there was something that happened that really impaired that. I know, for instance, my parents, my mother had me really young, And neither one of my parents were very race conscious. And I think that was purposeful in the sense that for them, they just wanted me to survive. And that anything that I would say or do that made it seem like I would be a target, they wanted to protect me from. So much so that, you know, when I first got a really radical political sensibility, I came home from college to see my younger brother at my parents' house. I remember playing a clip, I don't know who it was, maybe it was Khalid Muhammad or somebody that would freak out the average person who wasn't, you know, familiar. And I remember my mother being like, cut that off. You know, no reason, no explanation. And so I think what needs to happen, I've been very lucky to have found, you know, mentors, you know, people like Adar, you know, and others who have passed this down. But unfortunately, I've had to seek it out. Like I've had to search for it myself. I don't know the answer. I don't know how to fix that. But I definitely think it's important to acknowledge that that's the case. That passage of the information, somehow, for some reason, the only thing that I feel like I can say definitively about where that gap was created was the fact that post-civil rights, you have affirmative action and all these other opportunities that black folks got that created a bigger middle class for black folks. And then, you know, we're so scarred by racism and white supremacy that for us the solution was to find a place that will make us feel like our white counterparts. And so many folks fled out of the cities, out of the communities. And so, you know, so a lot of those folks that I think would provide the inspiration for a lot of us to take up the struggle, I think many of us just look around and didn't see anybody that I know for me, I didn't meet a black man with a radical political sensibility, a strong race consciousness until I was 20 years old. You know, and so I think it just has a lot to do with the fact that those opportunities that were gained by the civil rights movement had the effect of putting people in comfortable positions where, as far as they were concerned, it was easier just to live off of whatever paycheck than to rock the boat anymore.
I'm sorry, can we, just because we're running a little low on time and we want to get as many questions in as possible, come up, and then I see you too, sir. Okay.
I guess I have to give you a little background on my husband and I. We live in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, have a lot of African-American neighbors and friends that we associate with. And we also own a house that was built in 1791 and was part of the Underground Railroad. And we promote that history. This year we had our 7th annual Harriet Tubman Day of Remembrance. And I see a lot of people out there who are miniature Harriet Tubmans. In a way, I feel my husband and I are those kind of people too. We set up a website and we love the history. Harriet is my hero. And sometimes when I'm talking to young African-American men in their 18s, 19s, and 20s, I'll say, Harriet was my ancestor. Well, she is. She's gone before me. She made the world a better place, and I claim her as my own. And young African-American gentlemen will come up in my face and say, you're not black, you can't claim her. And I fight with them. I say, oh, yes, I can. She is a decent, wholesome, wonderful person, and I'm going to claim her. And I think we all need to embrace that. We all need to claim a great hero. I'm very emotional over this, but I have a very good African-American friend, and she always says to me, how come a little white red-headed woman has to tell me my history? And I think that's another problem. I don't think we have enough African Americans out there telling their history the way it should be told. I think it's whitewashed and changed and made easy, and we don't talk about the problems. Honestly, we go around the problems and we make them palatable, easier to swallow, and the situation never gets fixed.
So before we turn it over to the panel, and I see Dottie's wanting to jump in here, let me ask you, what would be your recommendation, suggestion to fix?
Well,
Issues.
first thing is my husband and I, for the last 2 years, have initiated a Harriet Tubman program in a Baltimore County school. Okay? I have people out there that say to me, I don't know who Harriet Tubman is, and they're African American, and they're young people. Okay? We need to push programs that will teach this history in a way that these young people can understand it. Now, the school itself puts on the program, and I believe when these children have fun learning, they learn, okay? And they sing the songs, and they tell the history, and they do the poems, and at the end of the day, I say to myself, I wonder if the message got across. But I know that it does, because one year I was a guest speaker for a Martin Luther King celebration, and 2 years later, a little boy came up to me, and he said, I remember you. You talked about Harriet Tubman and William Still and Frederick Douglass. So if I only hit one child and he remembered, that's one. And that may be how we have to do it, one at a time. But I believe these programs have to be in these schools.
Okay, thank you so much. And Dottie?
I think it's really wonderful that you claim Harriet Tubman as a hero and a model, and it sounds like the work you're doing is very, very important and commendable. I would say that the term ancestor has a very special and precise meaning that particularly for African Americans in this country is a very sacred term. It really means literally, as you would see the word defined, that you are a descendant of that person. That descent in this country from Africans who were enslaved is a source of strength and passion for life that has survived in African American culture that I don't think I, as a white person, have the right to claim for myself or for any of my people. So I would encourage you to, keep the term hero, keep the term model, keep the term, someone I admire and look up to and hold up as someone I want to keep before me as an example. But to not use the term ancestor in this particular context.
Dottie, do you feel that the fact that in this country so few people can identify any of the few white resistance fighters that fought for freedom, that history is not taught in schools, so that white people really don't have anybody that they are claiming? Is that a structural problem, and is that a component of structural racism?
If there's any history that's more hidden than the people we should look up to in communities of color in our history, it's the white people who stood up against white supremacy in our history. That is so buried that even though I've tried to study it for myself, I have trouble remembering the names because they're never out there, in the larger culture. And it's an omission that really affects our ability, particularly for white people, to see the models that we can model ourselves after, in addition to looking up to the models from African American and other communities of color. Every question, that we've had here tonight has had history as a major element of what people were looking for and asking about. And for me, particularly in regard to Mark's initial question about how do we work together, I think our history in this country of first taking the land away from the people who were here already. So we all carry that privilege of being on the land, and many of us owning the land that didn't really belong to us. And then the history of the enslavement of African people. That if we don't know that history and the history of resistance from both people of color and white people, we will constantly lose the threads that could keep us together. We have in our history so many examples of people who came to this country from different parts of the world and were originally considered black. That included Jews, it included Italians, it included Irish people. But the system of white supremacy is so brilliant that it manages to, at the right time, to benefit itself, to draw those people into whiteness. And that's continuing today as new immigrant groups come here. So that centrality of what happened to Native Americans and African Americans has to remain the core of any racial justice work. It has to, any racial justice work that's done to benefit other communities of color must always ask the question, how will this affect those two original communities who were dispossessed of everything by the system of white supremacy?
Thank you. And Anthony, you had a comment, and you had a question, sir? You can come up while Anthony's making his comment.
The only thing I would say, I push back against Dottie just a little bit, and I certainly understand exactly where she's coming from. But I would say, without going too deep, that you claiming Harriet Tubman as your ancestor, and then you pushing back against people who say you can't do that, keep doing that. Keep doing that. Claim that, but understand that why you get that pushback, why an African-American male would say to you, she's ours, you can't have her, is because we have lived in a society that have stripped black men, black boys, bare of their identity, of their relationships, of their families, of their education, of who they are. And so at times when you hear someone with all the best intention say, well, Harriet Tubman is my ancestor, I can understand why a black male would push back and say, no. Because we have literally had everything else co-opted. And so, but acknowledging that, I would also say that you keep, was that God? No, you keep.
No, that's not God.
That's not God. He was saying, shut up, Anthony. But you keep, own that. Own her history. Own her struggle. Own what she gave and contributed. And how she made this state and this world a better place. Keep owning that. Keep doing the work. Keep doing the heavy lifting. Keep being uncomfortable. Keep pushing your neighbors. Keep pushing. But understand why a young black male would say, wait a minute, white lady, she's ours.
Yeah, but now he waves to me and.
I'm sure.
But that's a different
Change the heart.
conversation. And we have not talked about
That's
the
right.
difference between appreciation and
That's right.
appropriation. And I think that that is an extremely important conversation. Davon, you were saying before that, about just everything being taken. And I think that that's probably a deeper conversation than we have time to go through here, because we do want to get more questions. But I would say to everybody, be aware of the difference between appreciation and appropriation. It's like people saying, I'm Native American. I can say I'm Native American, and I can say that with all honesty, right? But the thing is, I know nothing about that culture. I don't live it. I don't live the oppression of it. I don't live it. I can say that that's who I am, but I don't walk in the world that way, nor does the world see me that way. So am I appreciating or am I appropriating? And we live in a society that appropriates Native American history, culture, struggle, oppression all the time, while still claiming the privilege that we hold as we walk through the world. So I would just encourage everybody, I think you made a very appropriate point, Dottie, to really be careful about terms, words, and the way that we hold things. And Anthony, and I think you made an appropriate point about continuing to be inspired by people regardless of who they are. Inspiration is a good thing, and that is transferable. Appropriation, not so much. So you, sir, had a question or comment. How are you today?
Good, thank you. So I first want to thank the people who organized this event, because we need many more like these, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I know there are many people here who are doing very important work when you think of racial injustice, and we look at our schools, and we look at our employment area, and we look at voting, and we can look almost anywhere. But my question to the panel is, why is there so little attention paid to the racial injustice in our jails? And I say that not because we don't hear about the death penalty, and of course the abolition is, in my view, is a very important step forward, or we hear about injustice in other ways. But there are so many people, young people, people from the African American community, people, you know, who don't have any wealth whatsoever, who are arrested illegally, who are brought into our jails, who are denied a lawyer, you know, who is their only ticket out to get back to home and family and jobs. And there are just so many ways in which, when we look at the jail population, we're looking at people, many of them have needs. I mean, they have the same needs that, you know, that the white community has, whatever they might be, mental health, drugs, jobs, schools. But there's so little attention paid. It's so difficult to get people to look inside the jails. You know, you have a policy now where it's been going on for a while, but no one seems to even react to it. It's a 60-day policy that when people get arrested, they can't have visits from family. They can't have visits from friends. So you're taking people, you're bringing them into a jail situation, a central booking, and then you're saying no visits. And it makes absolutely no sense, but because there's very few people who even react to that denial of humanity, it allows all kinds of things to be happening, as we're seeing in our jails. Because we're not looking inside the place where most African American men are going to arrive at some point. At some point, they're going to have that experience, and others will too. But it's so difficult to get community to respond to the injustice. And when you get to the jail, of course, that's when you don't get your education. You get evicted from public housing. You can't get jobs because you got even an arrest record. So it just seems to me, I'm mystified by it.
Thank you. And Dottie and Davon, I know that you both have worked on this issue.
Well, the first thing I want to do is invite everybody to our June 13th event, which is on that very topic. We're going to be showing the film, The Central Park Five, which really is, you know, a prime example of the racial injustice in that system.
Can you also encourage people that if they haven't signed, to sign so that we can?
Yes, please put your information on the sign-up sheet so we can be sure that you get information. And please go to our website, bemoreantiracist.org, because then you'll be guaranteed to get information. You'll get an email back where you have to say, yes, I want to be part of this listserv or whatever it's called. And that way you'll be sure to get information. When I first began doing training and consulting around issues of race and white supremacy, it didn't take me long to conclude that the front line of racism being practiced in this country was in the so-called criminal justice system. And I basically got into a situation where my volunteer work outside of the racial justice work with our organization is on the issue of prisons and the criminal justice system. And I think, I would say, frankly, that any person who's claiming to work for racial justice and is not doing something, whether it's giving money to organizations that are working on this issue, whether it's volunteering time, whether it's educating other people about the injustice of the system, that you are not doing some of the most important racial justice work you should be doing.
I mean, I would say the reason why there isn't enough attention put to it is because, again, people have internalized the fact that black folks belong there. You know, I mean, I think it's hard for people to admit that to themselves, but, you know, people have internalized the idea that, particularly black men, but now increasingly black women, that there's an element of criminality that has been seared onto the way that we're represented in popular culture, to the extent that then people internalize that very notion. I was watching, I forget what it was. It was a study that was done on how police officers respond to incidents. And they referred to, so most of us are familiar with conscious decisions and subconscious decisions, but they refer to something called pre-conscious decisions, right? And so these are things that before, the thing about being a police officer is you have to make a bunch of pre-conscious decisions. So before you can even process what's going on, you have to make a split-second decision. And what this study found was that police officers had so internalized the notion of black criminality, right, that it was used to help explain the excessive amounts of black men that were shot down by the police as a result of the fact that they have internalized racism so much. Now, they would never speak it, and they were actually, their tests that some police districts give their employees to determine whether or not they have racial bias. But even in places where they administer this test, you can't affect the pre-conscious mind without really looking at the way that people have internalized the notion of black criminality. And so I think it's crucial that if we're going to, you know, in talking about issues of criminal justice, we have to talk about the ways in which all of us have internalized blackness as representing criminality.
Is this issue a primary issue of the 21st century movement, for the 21st century movement to address, Christina?
I would say yes. I think it's one of these issues that affects everyone in every single sphere of life. Because we're talking about creating this pipeline for our youth that essentially we're not giving them what they need to survive and to thrive in a community. We're just housing them, maybe providing some meals, and in some places very menial meals, or we're not providing any other access to health care or other issues. So it's something that we need to start talking about it. And from a perspective of being an attorney, we need to understand that the criminal justice system is fraught with racism. There's no place it's not impacting us. And if you're sending people into a courtroom without an attorney, that's dangerous, because all of the laws are set up in a way where they're not easy to understand. What I got from going to law school was the ability to understand how people write convoluted words together and try to make sense of something. And that's something that education in this particular way has advantaged me. And I highly encourage everyone to understand that the need for an attorney in any type of, not just criminal justice, but civil justice. When you're talking about child custody, when you're talking about divorces, you're talking about public benefits. All of those things are safety nets that are being ripped away from people because they don't have access to an attorney to help them navigate that system. So essentially, when you're creating poverty and perpetuating that poverty because they don't have access to justice, you're just setting it up for someone to have to commit a crime to even live. So it's something that needs to be talked about more often, and understanding that our justice system isn't one of justice per se.
So we have time for one more quick question. I saw your hand, and then closing remarks from our panel. And how are you this evening?
I'm well. I don't do well with quick, but I'll try.
Okay.
I also work at Towson University. I help with the debate team there. And the question I have stems from some of the theory that we use at Towson, a debate team that makes debate focus on issues of racial justice. I think I want to talk very briefly about what I feel is an importance to have some theoretical clarity on what Harriet Tubman means as a figure of revolution, and what that means for some of the things that have been spoken here today. So I was just at a laundromat, and there were two people having a conversation, and one of whom had a son who was just murdered. The other one had a son who had just gone to jail for murder, who was then murdered in prison. And I just think this speaks to the quotidian violence that Black people suffer, the everyday violence that is so deep in the communities, but those voices are so rarely heard because they don't have access to the privilege to have extra time to come to meetings like this. And so, to me, those voices always scream in their silence in these kinds of conversations, the depth of the violence that specifically Black bodies face in this community. that make it hard, for example, for me to quite understand what it means to have a white woman call Harriet Tubman an ancestor. Because my skin, my very corporeality, registers in society in a way that white skin just never will. And that gets me back to the question of where are the Harriet Tubmans? I think a lot of them are in jail or dropped out because this system doesn't support a truly radical interpretation of the level of violence black bodies face. One last question that struck me, and that leads to my question, is can there be white Harriet Tubmans? There are a lot of theories about how white people should use their privilege. And given Harriet Tubman didn't own a home, carried a shotgun to fight white supremacy, this sort of violent resistance to white supremacy to me indicates that, in my mind, the only theory of how white people could use that privilege effectively and really represent Harriet Tubman is this idea of white social suicide. And that's a strong term, but I think, in my mind, only that term could represent the depth of what white people have to do to engage their privilege. So people like Noah Ignatieff and the now deceased Joel Olson have written about the abolition of whiteness. And what that would mean to me is, as opposed to owning a home and bequeathing it to your children, you would like bequeath that home to radical black people who would use that money to teach radical black theory. And the distinction between using Harriet Tubman as we can teach her story and sing songs, I would teach Harriet Tubman as a black man is her story, and that means we need to figure out maybe we can have to lay on the street to have a protest and all get arrested. And a white body teaching Harriet Tubman as a, let's sing the songs she sang, registers very differently from a black body saying Harriet Tubman is a radical political figure who says we hate to think about something like violence as a political tool. Again, that doesn't mean kill white people. That doesn't mean white people should literally commit suicide. But my question, and I know you don't have time to answer it, is could there possibly be a theory of whiteness that has fidelity to Harriet Tubman and does not use white social suicide as its framework for how white people should use their privilege?
Thank you. So in 2 sentences or less. I joke, but we can't, we're at the end. So, but one thing that he asked, which is the snatch back, the taking back Harriet Tubman as a revolutionary figure who was willing to do whatever it took to free people from a system of structural racism. Do you see that happening today? Do we still need it today? And what can we do to get there and to teach that for people to be that? Dottie? Because everybody else is like, I want to think about that.
Well, that question got to the heart of it, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
I think that, you know, for me to answer that question honestly at this stage of my life, I'm not that radical. I'm just not, you know, I have to be honest. I think anyone who carries white privilege has to examine honestly what part of that privilege they are willing to give up. And it's a question that is not easy to answer, but if it's not asked, I think our work is never authentic in any way.
I think we got to move on. Davon? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say really quickly, it's funny, you know, Lawrence asking that question, to me it's like, I assume that those who are generally interested in the work understand. It's kind of the way I feel about America. It's like, obviously, it's decadent, you know, it's run its course in terms of, you know, its dominance in the world. It's obviously fundamentally anti-black and racist. It's important, though, for everyone else to know that. And I think sometimes people operate from different vantage points of the redeemability of America or the redeemability of whiteness. And I would say, really in agreement of his point, that unless you're a white person who is interested in the destruction of the cultural machinery of whiteness, right, then all the goals that you put forth in the context of racial justice will fall short of actually attaining the goal in a way that is authentically beneficial to people of color.
Thank you. Christina?
I guess my answer is going to be, are we incrementalists or not. And I think unfortunately our society does work in increments where there is some advance of social justice and then 2 steps back. And then there needs to be another push and then there's backlash. And you have this tension between success and then people suffering for that success. So understanding that and what your role is as a community activist or as an advocate in other areas or whatever your job is. Because this work is very tiring. This is not a work that you feel great every time you do it, because you get beaten down, essentially, when you're looking and you're trying to advocate for people, or you're trying to change people's lives and empower them to do whatever it is. But understanding to take your own temperature and realize, today I feel very strong, and I'm willing to talk about these issues and to call someone out on their racism and to call myself out on the racism. Whereas other times I may feel very disempowered and not able to support myself in doing this work. So that's when I need my allies and my peers to come and protect me from that onslaught of oppression so that I could live to fight another day. Because unfortunately, this is a long road that won't stop overnight if people give up that privilege. Because our tendency is to enjoy our privilege and to hold on to that privilege. I do it myself. So more often than not, I have to challenge my own privilege before I could start calling other people out on theirs. And start leaning on each other as we go through this process, because some days I'm too weak to say what I really feel in my heart.
Thank you. Anthony?
What I have learned, oftentimes by listening to people like Lawrence, is that I just am not and never will claim to be radical. I'm just not. But I have an opinion, and I value Lawrence's opinion to the nth degree. But I do not in any way believe that his opinion is any more valuable than my opinion, just because he holds a radical political thought or belief. And that's why I guess when we talk about radicalism and political thought, I support everyone being part of the dialogue and the conversation. I agree with Davon that at the end of the day, if your goal is to move this, you must smash the structural racism that allows it to exist. I'm just not sure if using words like social suicide, and I don't know how that gets us there. And it's not that I can't appreciate that rhetoric and that passion, but I'm not sure how far that's going to get us any more than a white person claiming Harriet Tubman as their ancestor. I really don't.
Well, I would like to thank each of our panelists, Dottie Burke-Markowitz, Davon Love, Christina Meneses, and Anthony McCarthy. And I would like to most of all thank you, because you had a choice as to where you spend these couple of hours, and you chose to spend them with us. In terms of Harriet Tubman, I would say that she was a woman who considered herself ordinary, but she did extraordinary and radical things with very concrete outcomes that were social and that were economic. And the bottom line is that this is a social and an economic argument. If you are willing to take on a piece of this journey where you can look at your outcomes and see the social and the economic change, then you too can claim to be inspired by Harriet Tubman. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.